The neighbors laughed at the mother who went to live in a cave with her young son. They were sure she wouldn't survive the winter and had simply gone mad. But none of them knew what she was building in the cave, and why they themselves would later have to come to her. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The land lay at the far edge of what people still dared to call settled. Beyond it, the mountains rose without names, ridges folding into one another like the backs of enormous beasts sleeping beneath snow and stone. Winds moved there with a will of their own, never fully still, even on the clearest days. They came down from the high passes, slipping through trees and ravines, pressing against walls, testing every structure built by human hands. This was frontier land, not because it was new, but because it had never truly been tamed. Eleanor Hawke's cabin stood where the slope began to harden into rock. It had been placed there years ago for reasons that once made sense. There was timber nearby, water within walking distance, and enough open ground to see danger coming. Her husband had chosen the spot with the quiet confidence of a man who believed effort could compensate for risk. The cabin had been raised quickly, with squared logs stacked and chinked with moss and mud, a pitched roof set just steep enough to shed snow when storms were kind. In the first winters, it had done its job. Not well, perhaps, but well enough. Now it did not. The walls no longer held their lines. Time and frost had worked at the joints until small gaps appeared, where daylight slipped through even at noon. The roof sagged in one corner, a subtle bow that grew worse each year. Inside, the air carried a smell Eleanor could never quite banish, a mix of damp wood, old smoke, and cold earth. Even when the fire burned steadily, the warmth never fully settled. It hovered close to the hearth and fled toward the corners, chased away by invisible currents that moved through the cabin as freely as the wind outside. Eleanor felt those currents most at night. She would lie awake beneath rough blankets, listening to the wind claw at the walls, feeling the cold creep inward as if it were alive. Each winter, she told herself it would be the last spent like this, that she would fix the roof, seal the gaps, make the place right again. Each winter, she learned how little those efforts mattered once the real cold arrived. Her husband had died 2 winters earlier, caught in a storm while checking traps high along the ridge. They had found him days later, frozen where he had fallen, his body half buried by drifting snow. There had been no drama in it, no last words or heroic struggle, only the quiet finality the mountains always imposed. Afterward, Eleanor had burned his clothes, kept his tools, and learned how to do the work he had once done without thinking. Grief had not been a single sharp pain, but a long, dull pressure, something she carried while chopping wood, mending lines, hauling water. There was no time to collapse under it. Survival did not allow for that kind of indulgence. What frightened her was not her own endurance. She discovered early on that she could withstand more than she had ever believed. Hunger, exhaustion, cold that numbed fingers until they felt like foreign objects. She endured all of it because she had to. What frightened her was her son. Samuel was 8 years old, slight for his age, with dark hair that refused to lie flat and eyes that noticed everything. He had grown up in this cabin, learned to walk on uneven floors, learned to sleep through wind and wolves and the constant small noises of a living wilderness. Yet the winters affected him differently. Eleanor saw it in the way he shivered long after she had grown accustomed to the cold, in the way his hands reddened and cracked, in the cough that settled into his chest each year like an unwanted guest. At night, she would wake to the sound of it, a thin, rattling cough that seemed too loud in the dark. She would rise quietly, adding wood to the fire, pulling the blankets tighter around him, pressing her palm to his forehead to feel the chill beneath his skin. Sometimes he slept through her ministrations. Sometimes he stirred and looked at her with unfocused eyes, trusting her without question. That trust frightened her more than the cold ever could. There were mornings when he did not want to rise from bed, when his limbs felt heavy and his breath shallow. Eleanor would pretend not to notice her own fear, would joke softly, coaxing him to eat, to move, to live as though the day were ordinary. She told herself that children were resilient, that frontier life made them stronger. Yet each time winter returned, she wondered how much resilience a body could truly hold. Neighbors lived miles away, scattered along the valley where the land briefly softened before rising again. They came by occasionally, usually under the pretense of checking on her or trading news. Their visits followed a pattern she learned to recognize. First came the questions, polite enough on the surface, about how she was managing alone, whether the boy was healthy, whether she had considered moving closer to town. Then came the suggestions, always phrased as concern. Perhaps she should sell the land while it still held value. Perhaps a woman with a child would be safer somewhere less exposed. Perhaps the mountains were no place to raise a boy without a father. Eleanor listened and nodded when politeness required it. She did not argue. She knew the shape of those conversations well enough to understand that resistance would change nothing. Beneath the words lay a simple judgment. She did not belong here. Not because she lacked skill or resolve, but because the role she occupied unsettled them. A woman alone might be pitied, a woman with a child even more so, but a woman who stayed, who refused to retreat, became something uncomfortable. She felt their eyes on the cabin when they left, lingering on its crooked roof and weathered walls. She could almost hear their thoughts, the unspoken certainty that it was only a matter of time. The storm that forced her to face the truth arrived early that year. The air had grown sharp weeks sooner than usual, and snow fell in heavy, wet sheets that clung to everything they touched. By nightfall, the wind rose, pushing against the cabin with relentless force. Eleanor fed the fire until the woodpile dwindled, then fed it again, knowing the cold would be worse if the flames died. Samuel sat close to the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, watching the shadows jump along the walls. Sometime after midnight came the sound she would remember long afterward. It was not loud at first, just a groan, a shifting weight overhead. Then came a crack, sharp and unmistakable, followed by the thud of snow and timber collapsing inward. Eleanor was on her feet before she fully understood what had happened, pulling Samuel away from the wall as debris scattered across the floor. They spent the rest of the night huddled together near the fire, the cold pouring in through the damaged roof. Snow sifted down in fine grains, melting as it touched the heat. Eleanor held her son close, her body forming a shield she wasn't sure was sufficient. She did not sleep. She counted his breaths, listened to the storm rage outside, and wondered if this was the night the mountains finally took what they had been patient enough to wait for. Morning came gray and silent. The wind died as suddenly as it had risen, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Snow lay piled high against the cabin, pressing against the walls, as if trying to force its way inside. The damaged section of roof sagged visibly now, beams exposed and splintered. Eleanor stepped outside, the cold biting at her face, and took in the full measure of what had happened. The cabin still stood, but only just. It looked less like a home and more like a warning. As she stood there, breath fogging the air, Eleanor understood something with a clarity that left no room for denial. This place, as it was, would not carry them through another winter. No amount of patching or mending would change the simple fact that the cabin had reached the limits of what it could endure. She could fix the roof, seal the gaps, pray for mild weather, but she would be gambling with her son's life. Samuel came to stand beside her, his small hand slipping into hers. He looked at the broken roof, then up at her, waiting. Eleanor squeezed his hand gently, her gaze fixed on the mountains rising beyond the cabin. For years, she had believed survival meant holding on, enduring, refusing to yield. Now she saw that survival sometimes meant admitting that what had once been enough no longer was. The house had stopped protecting them, and if she did nothing, the mountains would finish what time and cold had already begun. After the storm, the world around the cabin settled into a deceptive calm. Snow lay heavy and smooth across the ground, softening edges and hiding damage beneath a clean white surface. Eleanor spent the first days repairing what she could, propping up the weakened roof with scavenged beams, packing fresh moss into widening cracks, doing just enough to keep the cold from rushing back in all at once. The work exhausted her, not only because of the physical strain, but because she knew it was temporary. Each repair felt like pressing a hand against a door that was already giving way. Samuel stayed close as she worked, handing her tools, dragging small branches toward the firewood stack, watching her with a seriousness that did not belong to a child his age. Eleanor caught him glancing often toward the damaged roof, his gaze lingering as if trying to understand how something that had always been there could suddenly fail. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be all right, but the words felt fragile, unearned. Instead, she spoke of small things, of chores to be done, of the coming spring, though winter had barely begun. It was during one of those long days that Eleanor noticed the place beneath the rock. The stone outcrop lay a short distance from the cabin, part of the slope that rose sharply behind it. She had passed it countless times without giving it much thought. It was simply there, a massive shoulder of stone thrusting out from the mountainside, its surface worn smooth by centuries of wind and water. Now, with the snow piled high everywhere else, she saw something different. Beneath the overhang, the ground was nearly bare. A thin crust of ice clung to the edges where snow had blown in, but the earth beneath was firm and dry. She stopped there without fully intending to. The air felt different under the rock, less sharp, less restless. The wind that scoured the open ground slid past the stone, as if diverted by an unseen hand. Eleanor stood still, listening. The silence beneath the overhang was deeper, more contained, as though the mountain itself were holding its breath. Samuel joined her, his boots crunching softly as he stepped into the shadow of the rock. He looked around, then down at the exposed ground. "There's no snow here," he said, stating the obvious, with the quiet wonder children reserved for things that did not fit their expectations. Eleanor nodded, though she was no longer fully aware of him. Her attention had narrowed to a single thought forming slowly, cautiously, as if it feared being noticed too soon. She pressed her gloved hand against the stone. It was cold, but not biting, not the kind of cold that leached warmth on contact. It was steady, unchanging. "Why is it warmer?" Samuel asked. The question struck her with unexpected force. Eleanor opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. She realized she did not know, not in words. She only knew what she felt, what her body told her in the language of instinct. The earth held its temperature. The stone did not fight the cold the way wood did. It endured it. That night, as Samuel slept, Eleanor sat by the fire and thought of the rock. She thought of the way the wind had passed it by, of the dry ground beneath it, of the silence. She told herself it was nothing, just an observation. But her mind returned to it again and again. When the fire burned low and the cabin creaked in the cold, she imagined what it might be like to sleep beneath that stone, sheltered not by fragile timber, but by the mountain itself. The idea frightened her. It felt dangerous, not because it was reckless, but because it challenged everything she had been taught about what a home was supposed to be. Houses were built on the land, not into it. Shelter meant walls raised against the world, not retreating into its depths. And yet, the more she considered it, the more the thought refused to leave her alone. She began to act before she fully understood what she was doing. The next morning, she returned to the outcrop with a shovel and a pick. She told herself she was only clearing snow, only seeing what lay beneath. She scraped away the thin layer of ice and found firm earth below, darker and richer than the frozen ground elsewhere. The work was slow, awkward. The soil was compacted, heavy with moisture from beneath, but it yielded. By midday, Eleanor had cleared a shallow space beneath the overhang. She stood back, breathing hard, and tried to see it as something more than a hole in the ground. She failed. It looked small, inadequate, almost foolish. Doubt crept in immediately, sharp and insistent. What did she think she was doing? This was not how people lived. This was not how homes were built. The sound of voices reached her before she saw anyone. She turned to find two neighbors approaching on the packed snowpath that led past her land. They slowed as they took in the sight of her standing beneath the rock, shovel in hand, earth piled beside her. For a moment they said nothing. Then one of them laughed. Eleanor felt the sound more than she heard it, a sudden tightening in her chest. The men exchanged glances, amusement plain on their faces. One of them called out, asking if she had decided to bury herself early this year. The other added something about animals digging holes when winter grew too hard. She did not answer. She straightened, resting her hands on the shovel handle, and met their eyes. The laughter did not stop. It grew, feeding on itself, gaining confidence from her silence. They spoke freely then, offering opinions she had not asked for. It was madness, they said. Dangerous. A child had no place underground. One of them shook his head, muttering that grief made people do strange things. When they left, still laughing, Eleanor stood where she was for a long time. The words echoed in her mind long after their voices faded. She told herself they didn't matter. She told herself she had endured worse. Yet when Samuel appeared at the edge of the clearing, his expression uncertain, she felt something twist painfully inside her. Why were they laughing? He asked. Eleanor knelt in front of him, brushing dirt from her gloves. She searched for an answer that would protect him, that would not pass the weight of the moment onto his small shoulders. They don't understand, she said finally. It was the truth, though it felt thin. Understanding did not come easily, even to Eleanor. Over the following days, she worked beneath the rock whenever she could, clearing more ground, testing the space. The idea remained vague, shifting, never quite solid enough to grasp. She imagined walls, then dismissed them. She imagined sleeping there, then recoiled from the thought. Each step forward brought a new wave of doubt. Seeking something firmer, something that would make sense of her instinct, Eleanor turned to the one place that promised ready-made shelter. A narrow cave lay farther up the slope, partially hidden by brush. She had known of it for years, but had never paid it much attention. Now it seemed like an answer offered by the land itself. The cave was deeper than it appeared from the outside. The air inside was cool and still, the light fading quickly as she moved inward. At first, Eleanor felt a rush of hope. The rock enclosed her on all sides, shutting out the wind completely. This was what she had been looking for, she thought. Protection. Solidity. The hope did not last. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the moisture glistening along the walls, droplets forming and falling with slow, steady patience. The ground was uneven and damp beneath her boots. The air carried a faint, unpleasant smell. something old and stagnant. She tried to imagine a fire burning there, warmth settling into the stone, but the image would not hold. Still, desperation pushed her forward. She brought Samuel there the next day, setting up a small fire near the entrance, convincing herself that the damp would lessen with use. The cave felt colder with him inside, the space closing in, the air thick. Samuel said little, but Eleanor saw the way he hugged himself, the way his breath came shallow. Within days he began to cough again. The sound cut through Eleanor with brutal clarity. She knew then that she had made a mistake, that she had chased the wrong answer. The cave was not shelter, it was a trap. Word of her failure spread quickly. Neighbors came by, their concern sharpened by a note of triumph. They spoke to her more firmly now, urging her to abandon the land, to think of the child. Some were kinder than others, but the message was the same. She had proven their point. The idea was foolish, dangerous. That night, Eleanor sat alone by the fire, Samuel asleep beside her, his breathing uneven. The cabin felt colder than ever, its weaknesses glaring. She stared at the flames until her eyes burned, her thoughts circling the same question again and again. What was she doing wrong? The answer came not as a revelation, but as a quiet realization. She had been looking for a ready-made solution, a place that would accept her without effort. The cave had seemed promising because it required so little change. She had mistaken enclosure for protection. She rose and stepped outside, walking toward the rock once more. The moon cast long shadows across the snow, the outcrop looming dark and patient. Beneath it, the ground she had cleared remained dry. The air felt steady there, unchanged by night or storm. This place wasn't a cave. It did not swallow sound or trap moisture. It did not close in. It stood open, offering shelter without confinement. Eleanor understood then what she had missed. She did not need to hide within the earth. She needed to build with it. The laughter of her neighbors returned to her, sharp and dismissive. This time, it did not stop her. It hardened into something else, a quiet resolve that settled deep in her chest. She did not know exactly how she would do it. She had no plans, no measured drawings, no certainty beyond instinct. But she knew this much with absolute clarity. She would not abandon the land. She would not gamble her son's life on a house that had already failed them. If the earth held warmth, she would learn how to use it. If the stone could shelter them, she would make it do so. Let them laugh, she thought, standing beneath the silent rock. She had listened long enough. Eleanor returned to the rock before dawn, while the valley still lay in a gray half-light, and the world seemed undecided about whether it would wake at all. The laughter she had heard over the past days had not followed her into sleep, but it lingered now at the edge of her thoughts, distant and dull, like a sound carried from far away by the wind. She pushed it aside as she stood beneath the stone overhang and breathed in the still air. It was colder than the cabin had been on better nights, yet it lacked the sharpness that cut through skin and bone. The cold here did not attack, it simply existed. She walked the length of the overhang slowly, counting her steps, noting where the stone dipped lower, where it rose, where the ground sloped gently away instead of holding moisture. Her earlier clearing had been clumsy, guided by instinct rather than intention, but now her movements grew more deliberate. She crouched, pressed her palm against the earth, and waited. The soil was firm, cool, and steady. It did not crumble into icy shards the way the open ground did. It held. This, she realized, was the difference she had failed to see before. The cave had been a wound in the mountain, a hollow where water collected and air stagnated. The overhang was something else entirely. It was protection without enclosure, shelter without surrender. The mountain did not swallow this space. It guarded it. The thought settled in her mind with a weight that felt almost physical. She straightened and looked out toward the cabin, its patched roof barely visible through the trees. The choice before her no longer felt like an experiment or a desperate gamble. It felt necessary. She did not speak of it to Samuel at first. She set him to small tasks that kept him occupied while she worked beneath the rock. He gathered twigs and smaller stones, dragging them with exaggerated effort, proud of the role he played. Eleanor watched him often, noting how his movements were less sluggish here, how his breathing seemed easier when he lingered in the sheltered space. The cough that had worried her so deeply had softened, appearing less frequently, as if the earth itself were already beginning to offer him relief. The work was harder than anything she had attempted before. Clearing the ground beneath the overhang required patience and restraint. Eleanor resisted the urge to dig deep. Instead, she scraped away loose soil, leveling the surface just enough to create a stable base. She removed stones carefully, testing the ground beneath each one, learning where the earth yielded and where it resisted. It was slow, back-breaking labor, and by the end of each day, her muscles ached with a deep, persistent pain that did not fade with rest. Neighbors noticed. They always did. At first they watched from a distance, silhouettes against the white slope, pausing in their own routines to observe her efforts. Then they came closer, their curiosity sharpening into something less kind. They stood at the edge of the clearing, arms crossed, heads tilted, as if examining a strange animal. The comments followed soon after, louder now, less restrained. They asked what she thought she was building. They suggested she would collapse the mountain on herself. They joked that she was teaching the boy to live like a burrowing creature. One man laughed openly, shaking his head as though the sight were too absurd to take seriously. Eleanor felt the weight of their attention press against her back as she worked, each movement measured, deliberate. She did not answer. She did not look up. Silence became her shield. Each time she lifted a stone or packed earth into place, she reminded herself that this was not about proving anything. It was about warmth, about breath, about the quiet rise and fall of her son's chest at night. The laughter faded into background noise, no more relevant than the cry of distant birds. As days passed, the shape of her intent began to emerge. Eleanor marked out the space with stones set in a rough arc beneath the overhang, tracing the outline of walls that would rise just enough to enclose warmth without sealing it away. She gathered rocks from the slope, choosing them carefully, favoring those with flat faces and solid weight. Each one had to earn its place. She learned to read them by touch, to sense which would hold and which would crumble under pressure. Clay came from a shallow cut near the creek, heavy and cold, staining her hands a deep rusted brown. She mixed it with sand and bits of dry grass, kneading it until it reached a consistency that felt right, neither too wet nor too brittle. Moss she peeled from shaded stones, laying it out to dry before pressing it into the gaps between rocks. The work demanded constant attention. There was no room for carelessness here. A poorly placed stone, a rushed seam, could mean cold air creeping in where it did not belong. Samuel watched closely, learning without being taught. He handed her smaller stones, mimicking her careful selection, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sometimes he asked questions, not about the building itself, but about why it mattered. Eleanor answered simply. She spoke of warmth, of safety, of making a place that would not fight them every night. She did not speak of fear or failure. She let the work itself carry those truths. The walls rose slowly, course by course, hugging the natural curve of the overhang. They were not tall. Eleanor resisted the instinct to build upward. Height, she understood now, invited cold. Instead, she built thick, solid, letting the stone shoulder the weight while the earth held the heat. When she stepped inside the growing structure, the difference was already noticeable. The air felt stiller, more contained. Sound softened, absorbed by stone and soil rather than bouncing back harshly as it had in the cave. The laughter from the neighbors grew louder as the structure took shape. They came more frequently now, some under the guise of curiosity, others openly mocking. A few brought their children, pointing and whispering as though the scene were a lesson in what not to do. Eleanor felt the sting of it most when she saw Samuel notice their reactions. She worried that he would absorb their words, that doubt would take root in him as it threatened to do in her. One afternoon, after a particularly cruel remark had been thrown her way, Samuel asked quietly why people were angry with her. Eleanor paused in her work, her hands resting against the cool stone. She searched for the right words, aware that whatever she said would shape how he understood not just this moment, but himself. "They're not angry," she said at last. "They're afraid of things they don't understand." Samuel considered this, then nodded, as if filing the explanation away for later use. He returned to stacking stones, his small fingers working with careful determination. Watching him, Eleanor felt something shift within her. The fear that had driven her from the cabin began to loosen its grip, replaced by a steadier resolve. She was no longer reacting. She was building. As the walls neared completion, Eleanor tested the space constantly. She lit small fires near the entrance, watching how the warmth moved, how it settled against stone rather than escaping upward. She observed how the air flowed, how the opening beneath the overhang allowed smoke to drift away without pulling heat with it. Each small success strengthened her confidence, not in the idea itself, but in her ability to learn from the land rather than impose herself upon it. The first night they slept beneath the stone was not planned. Eleanor had intended to finish reinforcing the walls before attempting it, but exhaustion overtook her. The cabin felt farther away than usual, colder, less inviting. On impulse, she spread blankets within the half-finished shelter and built a small fire. Samuel curled beside her, his body warm against hers. Eleanor did not sleep deeply. She listened, as she always did, to the sounds of the night. But something was different. The wind passed overhead without reaching them. The fire burned steadily, its heat lingering even after the flames died down. When Samuel stirred, it was not from cold, but from dreams. His breathing remained even, his cough absent. By morning, Eleanor knew there would be no turning back. The following days blurred into a rhythm of labor and observation. She reinforced the walls, thickening them where the stone dipped, sealing gaps with careful hands. She adjusted the opening, narrowing it just enough to reduce drafts while preserving airflow. Each adjustment brought subtle changes. The shelter grew warmer, drier, more consistent. Eleanor felt it in her bones, in the way fatigue did not sink as deeply into her muscles when she rested there. The neighbors' laughter began to change. It did not disappear, but it lost some of its sharpness, its certainty. Doubt crept into their voices, even as they mocked. Eleanor sensed it without looking up. She no longer needed to hear their words. The shelter itself answered them. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the air grew cold once more, Eleanor stood inside the nearly finished structure and surveyed her work. It was not beautiful in any conventional sense. The walls were uneven, the stone rough, the earth stained with the marks of her hands. Yet it felt right. It felt honest. She rested her palm against the wall and closed her eyes. The mountain was no longer something to be endured. It had become a partner, offering its strength without demand. Eleanor understood then that the building itself was only part of what she had set in motion. She was not merely constructing a shelter. She was redefining what safety looked like on her own terms. Outside, the first true winds of winter began to stir again, whispering of storms yet to come. Eleanor opened her eyes and met the sound without fear. She had gone against everyone. Now she would see if the land would stand with her. Winter did not announce itself with ceremony. It arrived the way it always did in the high frontier, quietly at first, with mornings that felt sharper than the day before, and evenings when the sky dimmed earlier, as though the sun were retreating from an argument it no longer wished to fight. Eleanor noticed the change in the way sound traveled. Footsteps carried farther. The crack of splitting wood echoed longer against the slopes. Even voices seemed to thin in the cold, as if words themselves grew brittle. The shelter beneath the stone was finished just as the first real frost settled into the ground. Eleanor had not marked the moment with any declaration. There was no clear line between construction and completion, only a point at which she stopped adding and began trusting. The walls were thick enough now, the seams sealed with care and patience. The entrance sat low and deliberate, shaped to turn the wind aside rather than invite it in. The stone above loomed heavy and unmoving, its presence constant, almost reassuring. Eleanor still kept the cabin standing. She did not tear it down or abandon it outright. It remained where it had always been, patched and imperfect, a reminder of the life she had lived before this choice. Yet she no longer slept there. Each evening, as the cold deepened, she and Samuel moved beneath the rock, carrying what they needed, settling into the space that felt more like a living thing than a structure. The first nights were spent listening, waiting for failure. Eleanor expected drafts, creeping damp, some flaw she had overlooked. Instead, she found steadiness. The cold came in waves. One night would be merely uncomfortable, the next bitter enough to sting exposed skin in seconds. Eleanor measured the difference not by numbers she did not have, but by sensation. Beneath the stone, the air remained even. It did not warm quickly, but neither did it betray them. The fire burned slower, its heat lingering in the walls long after the flames died. When Eleanor woke in the dark, it was not to Samuel shivering beside her, but to silence. Snow followed. It fell lightly at first, thin sheets that dusted the ground and vanished by midday. Then came heavier storms, the kind that erased tracks within hours and weighed down branches until they snapped. Eleanor watched from beneath the overhang as the world transformed, the familiar shapes of the land buried under white. The shelter held. Snow piled against the outer walls, forming an additional barrier, sealing warmth in rather than pressing cold through. Neighbors fared less well. Eleanor heard it in passing conversations when she ventured out for water or supplies. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow. Fires burned day and night, devouring wood faster than it could be cut. Children cried from the cold, and men grew short-tempered from exhaustion and fear. She saw it in their faces when they crossed her land, the strain etched deep, the bravado worn thin. At first they still laughed. They laughed when they saw her smoke, drifting lazily upward from beneath the stone. They laughed when they noticed how little wood she seemed to burn. They laughed because laughter was easier than admitting doubt. Eleanor paid them no mind. She had learned that the sound no longer held power over her. The shelter answered every question they did not dare ask aloud. The first true test came with the storm that tore down the valley without warning. The sky darkened in the middle of the afternoon, clouds rolling in low and heavy, pressing against the peaks. The wind rose fast, not gradually, but in sudden violent gusts that bent trees and sent loose snow spinning like smoke. Eleanor felt it in her chest before she heard it fully. A deep vibration carried through the ground. She and Samuel were inside when it struck. Eleanor fed the fire carefully, not piling wood recklessly, but building a steady heat she trusted the walls to hold. Outside, the wind screamed, a sound so fierce it seemed to scrape against the stone itself. Snow battered the entrance, swirling and piling, trying to force its way in. Eleanor watched the edges closely, ready to act, ready to block any breach. Nothing came. The walls remained still. The stone overhead did not groan or shift. The air inside held its calm, the fire crackling softly, almost lazily, in defiance of the chaos beyond. Samuel slept through the worst of it, his body relaxed, his breathing deep and even. Eleanor stayed awake, listening, waiting for the moment the shelter would fail her. It never did. Hours passed, then more. The storm raged into the night, and still the space beneath the rock held. Eleanor felt the heat stored in the walls radiating back into the room, a gentle return that required no effort on her part. When she finally allowed herself to rest, it was with a sense of disbelief that bordered on awe. She slept not because she was exhausted, but because she felt safe. Morning revealed a world transformed yet again. Snow lay piled higher than Eleanor had ever seen, drifts reaching past her waist in places. Trees leaned under the weight, some broken entirely, their limbs scattered like casualties. She stepped outside cautiously, surveying the damage. The shelter stood unchanged, its entrance partially buried, but intact. Eleanor dug a path free with deliberate care, her movements unhurried. It was then she heard the first knock. At first she thought the sound was part of the wind, some echo carried from far away. Then it came again, sharper, unmistakable. Eleanor turned to see a man standing a short distance away, his shoulders hunched, his breath visible in quick, desperate bursts. She recognized him as one of the neighbors who had laughed the loudest in weeks past. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood there, looking at the shelter, with an expression that held no humor at all. When he finally found his voice, it was rough, stripped of its usual certainty. He asked if she had room, if he could warm himself for a moment. Eleanor did not answer right away. She studied him, noting the frost clinging to his beard, the tremor in his hands. She stepped aside. Inside, the warmth struck him visibly. His shoulders sagged, his breath slowing as he moved closer to the fire. He did not thank her. Gratitude came later, after pride had finished unraveling. Soon, another followed, then another. Word traveled fast in winter. By midday, several neighbors had gathered beneath the stone, standing close, speaking little. Their faces told the story more clearly than words ever could. No one laughed. Eleanor offered them no explanations. She did not recount her failures or her reasoning. She did not say, "I told you so," or wait for apologies that would have meant little. She handed out cups of warm water, made space where she could, watched as children who had been stiff and silent began to move again. Samuel sat among them, quiet but calm, a small anchor in the midst of it all. As the storm cycle continued through the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated itself. When the cold sharpened and the wind howled, people came. Sometimes they stayed only long enough to warm their hands. Sometimes they lingered, reluctant to step back into the hostility of their own homes. Each visit stripped another layer of doubt from the laughter that had once surrounded Eleanor's work. Winter pressed harder as the season deepened. Nights grew longer, the cold more insistent. Yet beneath the stone, life found a rhythm Eleanor had not thought possible. The shelter did not conquer the winter. It endured it, patiently, without struggle. Eleanor learned to trust that steadiness, to plan her days without constant fear of collapse or failure. She noticed the change in herself as much as in the world around her. Her movements grew less frantic, Her thoughts no longer raced ahead to worst-case futures. She began to think beyond survival, beyond the next storm, allowing space for the simple act of living. Samuel thrived in that space. His strength returned, his laughter coming more easily, his nights unbroken by coughing. By midwinter, the laughter had disappeared entirely. Neighbors passed her land more quietly now, their glances lingering on the shelter with something like respect. Some asked questions, tentative at first, as if afraid to disturb whatever balance she had found. Eleanor answered when she chose to, her words simple, practical. She spoke of stone and earth, of patience and listening. She did not speak of defiance or victory. The winter did not grow kinder. If anything, it became harsher, as though determined to test every claim made against it. Yet each storm only strengthened Eleanor's certainty. The shelter did not need to prove itself anymore. It had done so in silence, through endurance. Standing beneath the stone one evening as snow fell steadily outside, Eleanor watched Samuel sleep and felt a quiet gratitude settle over her. The decision she had made, mocked and doubted, had carried them through the worst the season could offer. She knew now that survival did not always come from fighting harder or building higher. Sometimes it came from yielding to the land, from understanding its language and allowing it to lead. Winter had decided everything, and it had chosen to let them stay. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came hesitantly, in fragments, as though the land itself were unsure whether it was safe to soften again. Snow withdrew inch by inch from the lower slopes, revealing dark, damp earth beneath. Streams broke free from their frozen banks, running loud and fast with meltwater that carried the weight of the mountains downhill. The air lost its sharp edge, though the nights still held a reminder of winter's grip. Eleanor noticed the change first in the shelter. The walls no longer radiated stored warmth in the same way they had through the coldest months, but they remained steady, dry, unchanged by the thaw. Water ran past the entrance instead of seeping in. The stone above shed moisture without complaint. The place did not resist the season's shift. It adapted, as it had all along. When Eleanor walked back to the old cabin for the first time in weeks, she did so with a sense of distance she had not expected. The structure looked smaller than she remembered, its flaws more apparent in the gentler light. The roof sagged where she had propped it through winter. Damp stains marked the walls. It had survived, but only barely, and not without constant effort. Standing there, Eleanor felt no anger toward it, only clarity. This had been a chapter of her life, not its foundation. Around her, the settlement bore the scars of winter. Some cabins leaned at new angles, their frames twisted under the weight of snow. Others showed dark patches where cold had crept in, where dampness had taken hold. People moved more slowly now, not from cold, but from exhaustion. Winter had taken its toll, and everyone knew it. What surprised Eleanor most was not the damage, but the quiet. The laughter that had once followed her movements had vanished. No one joked as they passed her land. No one offered clever remarks about holes in the ground or living like animals. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the sounds of work. Men and women labored with a focus born not of pride, but of necessity. They had learned what winter could do. They had learned who had endured it. Eleanor saw them watching her shelter from a distance, not openly now, but with a careful attention that carried respect. Some approached slowly, as if uncertain they were welcome. When they spoke, their voices lacked the easy confidence they once held. They asked questions without mockery, listening closely to her answers. She did not present herself as a teacher. She did not gather them or explain unprompted. When asked, she spoke plainly. She described how the earth held temperature, how stone resisted change, how openings mattered more than walls. She spoke of mistakes as readily as successes, of the cave that had failed her, of the damp that had nearly undone everything. She did not frame her choices as wisdom. She framed them as learning. Soon, shovels appeared where laughter had once stood. Eleanor watched as neighbors began clearing ground near their own rocks and slopes, mimicking her movements with tentative care. They dug shallow at first, uncertain, then deeper as confidence grew. Stone was hauled, clay mixed, moss gathered. The valley changed, slowly, quietly, as structures unlike any before took shape. No one announced the shift. No one claimed ownership of the idea. It spread not as a declaration, but as an understanding. Samuel noticed before Eleanor did. He pointed out new shelters forming along the ridge, his voice bright with recognition. He spoke of them as though they were natural, as though this way of living had always been there, waiting. Eleanor listened, feeling something loosen inside her. The fear that had driven her through the winter had receded, leaving space for something else. Not pride, but peace. With spring came a different kind of responsibility. People came more often now, not to seek warmth, but to seek guidance. Eleanor found herself walking the land with them, pointing out the way snow had piled and melted, the places where water ran and where it did not. She explained how she had watched before acting, how she had let the land show her what it would tolerate. She emphasized patience above all else. There were moments when the weight of it pressed on her, when she longed for the solitude she had once known. She remembered the quiet days when survival had been her only concern, when decisions affected no one beyond herself and her son. Now, her choices echoed outward, shaping how others lived. The realization unsettled her at times. Yet each evening, when she returned beneath the stone and watched Samuel play or sleep, the balance restored itself. This had never been about leading or proving anything. It had been about keeping a child warm through the night. Everything else had followed from that simple need. The land responded to the changes with indifference. Spring storms came and went. Rain tested new walls. Wind probed new shelters. Some failed, and Eleanor helped where she could, offering advice, not judgment. She knew now that failure was part of learning, as essential as success. The mountain did not grant protection freely. It demanded understanding. As weeks passed, the settlement took on a different shape. Smoke rose from places that had once been bare. Paths shifted, favoring new routes shaped by practical need rather than habit. Life adjusted itself around the lessons winter had enforced. One afternoon, Eleanor stood with Samuel near the shelter, watching clouds gather over the peaks. The air was mild, carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth. Samuel pressed his hand against the stone wall, his palm flat, his expression thoughtful. "It keeps us safe," he said quietly, "like the mountain is holding us." Eleanor felt the truth of it settle deep within her. She had not conquered the land. She had not outwitted it. She had listened, adapted, and allowed herself to change. In doing so, she had found a way not just to survive, but to belong. When the sun dipped behind the ridge and shadows stretched across the valley, Eleanor looked out over the shelters, scattered like extensions of the earth itself. The laughter that had once defined her isolation was gone, replaced by a shared silence that carried understanding rather than scorn. Winter had taken much, but it had given clarity in return. Eleanor knew that seasons would continue to test them, that the land would never be gentle. Yet she no longer feared that truth. She had learned its language, and in doing so, had given her son something more enduring than shelter. She had given him a place in the world that did not laugh at difference, but learned from it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. New stories are coming, and the next one continues tomorrow. Watch the other videos on the channel and share this story with someone who might need it.